Jaguar Chapter 2, page 18. By March, I'd had just about enough of the home. More snow had fallen, and school was closed for a few days. The library van couldn't make it up the driveway, so there were no new books to read. The snow also kept the inmates' relatives away, which made everyone pretty gloomy. The staff tried to cheer the inmates up by scheduling group games and theatrical skits, but the inmates weren't very enthusiastic. Even Tall seemed depressed by our snowy isolation. He spent most of his time in his room looking through the spotting scope of the doc and had given him for Christmas. I made it a point to drop by his room several times a day and see how he was doing. A couple of times I found him sitting in front of the spotting scope, sound asleep, with his long gray braids dangling over his lap. I was worried about my father. It wasn't like him not to call or write. Peter guessed that the mail system in Brazil was not very good, and the snow around here hasn't helped our own mail system, he said. He was probably right, but it didn't lessen my growing concern. I started to think of ways to get down to Brazil. I had a valid passport, and with the credit card Doc had left me, I could buy a ticket. But there were a number of obstacles standing in my way. One of the problems was Peter. He was responsible for me, and there was no way he would let me go trapezing off to the wilds of Brazil. And if I ran away, he'd go out of his mind with worry, to say nothing of how this would affect the other inmates. I couldn't do this to them. An even bigger barrier was the fact that I had no idea where Doc was. I knew he had flown to a city called Manaus, but he could be anywhere by now. When I went to Kenya to find Doc after my mother died, I at least had a rough idea where he was. And what if I managed to fly down to Brazil and he was on his way back to the States? It seemed that my only choice was to wait and worry. My mood swung between frustration and fury. Frustration because there wasn't anything I could do, and fury at Doc for leaving me behind and not staying in touch. One afternoon I got so fed up I just had to talk to someone about my situation. It was Saturday and Peter was off. My only choice was try talking to Tall. There was only about 50% chance that he would remember who I was or hear what I had to say, but I didn't care. I was willing to try anything to get rid of the bitter thoughts stampeding through my head. I knocked on his door. He didn't answer. I knocked again, then opened the door. As usual, he was sitting at his window looking through the spotting scope. He didn't turn around. I walked over and sat on the bed. I need to talk, Tall. He still didn't turn around. I'm getting kind of frustrated living here, and I'm worried about Doc. I told him about everything that was bothering me. It must have taken me 20 minutes to get to the end. All through it, Tall didn't move a single muscle in his thin body. He just continued looking through the spotting scope. I doubted he had heard a single word I said. He probably thought my speech was one of the shows on the downstairs televisions. Despite this, I felt a little better letting it all out like that. I got up from the bed. Nice talking to you, Tall. I started towards the door. A buck. I stopped and turned around. Tall was in exactly the same position. I thought for a moment that I was having an audio hallucination. Then I heard it again. A buck. At first, I thought he wanted $1. I didn't know why he needed money. Sometimes it's simpler not to question my grandfather. I took out my wallet. Tall moved away from the scope and pointed out the window. Look. I walked over and looked through the spotting scope. I put my wallet away, feeling a little stupid. A big buck, as in deer, was standing by a tree near the frozen lake. He was stretching his neck up to nibble on the last clump of leaves within reach. You should stalk him, Tall said. What? Like you told me you learned in Kenya. When I was in Kenya, I was taught to stalk animals by a Maasai named Sapit. When I got back to Poughkeepsie, I told Tall about it. At the time, I didn't think he was even listening. I hadn't thought about stalking since I got to the home. That was different, I said, turning away from the scope. For one thing, it was a lot warmer, and there wasn't 2 feet of snow on the ground. Wear warm clothes. In Kenya, I stalked without any clothes, I said. I was naked. Too cold here, he pointed out. You'll have to wear clothes. Perhaps all you need is a good stalk. I'll watch you through the telescope. I looked through the scope at the buck again. He was on the far side of the lake. A light snow was falling, blown by an east wind. I'd have to go around the lake from west so I could come upwind of him. It would take me a long time, I said. I have plenty of time. I don't know how close I can get. Well, you can try. I went back to my room, put on white running shoes and 3 shirts, and grabbed a pillowcase. Next stop was the linen closet where the nurses kept their laundered white uniforms. I found a pair of Peter's pants and slipped them on over the pants I was wearing. I put my coat on, then found a white lab coat big enough to fit over it. The next item was a pair of disposable surgical gloves, which wouldn't keep my hands warm, but would camouflage them to some degree. The final touch was the pillowcase. I found a black marker and put the pillowcase over my head and made 2 marks over my eyes. I took it back off and cut out holes, then put it back on and looked in the mirror. I looked as if I was ready for Halloween. The next challenge was to get out of the house without anyone seeing me in this getup. That was relatively easy because one of the inmates was putting on a piano recital and everyone downstairs was in the recreation room listening. It wasn't as cold as I thought it would be outside. In fact, when I began high-stepping through the deep snow, I started to get a little hot. I waved at Tall up in his window and hoped that he'd be able to keep track of me as I got closer to the buck. My plan was to move at a regular pace until I got about 150 yards from the buck. As I made my way around the lake, I performed little experiments while I plowed through the deep snow. It was much more difficult than tracking in Kenya because I had to lift my foot 2 feet in the air every time I took a step. Before I began my true stalk, I stopped and caught my breath. The buck was on the other side of a large tree. If I moved slowly and kept the tree between me and the buck, there was a good chance of getting at least as close as the tree before the buck sensed me. I started, 1 slow step at a time, like a blue heron walking in shallow water. At first, my legs cramped, but I ignored the pain, and eventually it went away. I got into the rhythm of the stalk, a zone where nothing mattered but getting to the buck undetected. As I drew closer, I concentrated on the buck's ears. They were constantly moving, like twin radar dishes monitoring the snow-covered landscape for incoming threats. The nearer I got, the slower I moved. When the buck looked my way, I stopped in mid-step, holding that position until he looked away and started eating again. When I reached the tree, I stood behind the trunk. I was so close I could hear him pulling the brittle leaves off of the branches. He wasn't more than 6 or 7 feet away from me. I rested, then very, very slowly moved out from behind the tree. The buck stopped eating and looked directly at me with his ears pricked forward. His nostrils flared, and I could see his breath. He didn't know what I was or how I had gotten there. Trick or treat, I whispered and pulled the pillowcase off my head. The buck snorted and wheeled around on his hind legs. He bounded away with the underside of his tail sticking straight up in the air like a white flag. I should have felt guilty for disturbing his meager winter meal, but instead I was ecstatic. I jumped up and waved the pillowcase in the air, hoping that Tall had seen the whole show. Knowing him, he'd probably dozed off halfway through, but I didn't care. As Tall predicted, the stalk had made me forget my problems for the first time since Doc had left for Brazil. I walked back to the home feeling great. It was nearly dark by the time I got there. Before going inside, I slipped off my wet running shoes and Peter's pants. I ran up the stairs to Tall's room to find out how much he had seen of the stalk. There were about 30 people crammed into his room and more people spilling into the hallway. "I couldn't see," Mrs. Mapes complained. "We need more of them telescopes," Mr. Clausen said. As I pushed my way into the room, people patted me on the back and congratulated me. Tall was sitting on the bed smiling. In fact, everyone was smiling and laughing. It was as if the depression of the last week had been miraculously taken away. I invited a couple friends up, Tall said. How much of it did you see? We took turns, he said. They let me look when you stepped out from behind that tree. Marcy, the duty nurse, pushed her way through the crowd to Tall's bed. I knocked on your door, Jake, and you weren't there. Then I came down here and discovered what you were up to. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This fax from your father came while you were out back. I took the piece of paper. I didn't want to read it in front of the others. I excused myself and went down to the window seat and turned the light on. Dear Jake, sorry I haven't written or called. It's been crazy down here, and I thought I would be coming back up there any day, so I didn't get in touch. It looks like this is going to take longer than I thought. There's an airline ticket waiting for you at Kennedy International Airport. The flight leaves on March 21st and returns on March 30th. Just go to the Pan Am counter with your passport. You're on flight 636 to Brasilia. You'll have to spend the night in Brasilia and catch the afternoon flight to Manaus. You can stay at one of the hotels near the Brasilia airport. The only thing you need to do before you leave is to overnight your passport to the Brazilian embassy for a visa. I've contacted them and they'll stamp it and get it back to you before takeoff. I'm sure Peter can give you a hand with this. We're looking forward to your visit. Love, Dad. Visit? The date coincided with my spring vacation. It didn't sound as if Doc was coming home anytime soon, and it was clear that he didn't want me to stay down there with him. Tall came down the stairs and joined me on the seat. I was surprised to see him on the stairs without a nurse, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I showed him the fax. We'll miss you here, he said. I'll only be gone a week. When do you leave? He asked. Next Saturday. He looked at the lamp. Is this working out for you? I stared at him. Did you put this lamp here, Tall? He nodded. I thought Peter put it here for me. How did you? Shh. He held his finger to his lips. I'm not supposed to use the stairs without a nurse.